The village hall of St. Mary Mead had been transformed into something approaching festive splendor, though the transformation owed more to enthusiasm than to budget. Paper chains drooped cheerfully from the rafters, and someone had draped the ancient radiators with holly that crackled ominously whenever the heating system wheezed to life. The annual winter charity auction was always held on the second Saturday of December, a tradition that had survived 2 wars and countless changes in village leadership, largely because Mrs. Emmeline Hartwell possessed the sort of determined cheerfulness that could organize anything and the sort of social position that made resistance inadvisable. Miss Jane Marple sat in the 3rd row, her knitting bag at her feet and a small wrapped parcel on her lap. She had contributed a hand-knitted tea-cozy, practical, she felt, and the sort of thing that might genuinely please someone. Around her, the familiar faces of St. Mary Mead wore their auction expressions, polite interest masking calculations about what they could afford and what they actually wanted. At the front of the hall, Mrs. Hartwell consulted her clipboard with the air of a general reviewing battle plans. She was a woman of 50-odd years whose energy seemed to increase rather than diminish with age, and whose organizational abilities were matched only by her talent for extracting charitable donations from reluctant neighbors. Her husband, Colonel Hartwell, stood beside the makeshift auction table looking as if he'd rather be anywhere else, which was probably accurate. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mrs. Hartwell announced, tapping her gavel against a wooden block, "we shall begin with our traditional mystery parcels, gifts donated anonymously for the sheer joy of giving. Remember, the fun lies not in knowing what you're buying, but in the delightful surprise of discovery." A ripple of polite laughter went through the crowd. Miss Marple noticed how Dr. Geoffrey Pembroke, sitting near the front with his wife Margaret, shifted uncomfortably at the mention of anonymous gifts. The good doctor had recently returned to the village after several years practicing in London, and his reintegration into local society had been marked by a certain nervous energy that suggested he found small-town life more challenging than metropolitan medicine. Behind the Pembrokes, young Timothy Fletcher sat alone, his mechanic's hands clasped tightly in his lap. At 26, he was one of the village's more eligible bachelors, though his shy nature and modest circumstances had prevented him from making much progress with any of the local young ladies. Miss Marple had observed him glancing frequently toward the back of the hall, where Miss Rosalind Hartwell, the Colonel's niece, sat with her companion, Miss Patricia Wynne. Rosalind Hartwell was one of those young women whose beauty was so quietly perfect that it seemed almost accidental. At 24, she had inherited a modest fortune from her late parents, which made her both independent and, in the eyes of several young men, highly desirable. Miss Wynne, her childhood friend who had recently moved to the village to serve as her companion, was perhaps less conventionally attractive, but possessed a sharp intelligence that Miss Marple found intriguing. The auction began with the usual assortment of items: preserves, hand-knitted items, books, and small household goods. Mrs. Hartwell wielded her gavel with theatrical enthusiasm, and the bidding proceeded with the sort of restrained competition that characterizes English charity events. Spirited enough to raise money, but not so spirited as to appear vulgar. It was when they reached the mystery parcels that the evening took its dramatic turn. The parcels were arranged on a separate table, each wrapped in brown paper and tied with string, their contents deliberately concealed. Mrs. Hartwell had numbered them from 1 to 12, and the bidding had proceeded smoothly through the first 10. Number 11 had just been sold to Mrs. Dolly Bantry for 30 shillings when Mrs. Hartwell lifted the final parcel. "And now our last mystery offering," she announced. "Number 12. Rather elegantly wrapped, I must say. Shall we start the bidding at 10 shillings? The parcel was indeed more elaborately presented than the others, wrapped in deep burgundy paper with a silver ribbon that caught the light from the overhead fixtures. It was roughly the size of a shoebox, but something about its weight, evident from the way Mrs. Hartwell handled it, suggested it contained something substantial. The bidding was brisk, Dr. Pembroke raised his hand at 15 shillings, only to be outbid by Timothy Fletcher at 20. Miss Wynne entered the competition at 25 shillings, which prompted a determined response from Mrs. Celia Worthington, the village's self-appointed arbiter of social propriety. 35 shillings, called a voice from the back of the hall. All heads turned to see Mr. Alistair Blackwood, a recent arrival to St. Mary Mead, who had purchased the old Thornfield property and set about renovating it with more money than taste. Blackwood was a man in his early 40s whose success in some unspecified business venture had afforded him early retirement and a tendency toward condescension that had not endeared him to his new neighbors. The bidding continued, climbing to 45 shillings before Mrs. Worthington gracefully withdrew. Timothy Fletcher made one last effort at 50 shillings, but Blackwood's confident 60 shillings effectively ended the competition. "Sold to Mr. Blackwood for 60 shillings, Mrs. Hartwell announced, bringing her gavel down with a satisfied crack. "Quite a generous contribution to our cause." Blackwood made his way to the front of the hall with the sort of swagger that suggested he was accustomed to winning. He handed over his money to Colonel Hartwell and accepted the burgundy-wrapped parcel with a theatrical bow to the audience. "Shall I open it now?" he asked, his voice carrying clearly through the hall. "Or would you prefer to maintain the mystery?" "Oh, do open it," called Mrs. Bantry. "We're all dying to know what was worth 60 shillings. A chorus of agreement rose from the crowd. Blackwood grinned and began to untie the silver ribbon with deliberate slowness, clearly enjoying being the center of attention. The burgundy paper fell away to reveal a polished wooden box, dark mahogany with brass corner fittings that gleamed in the hall's lighting. "Rather handsome," Blackwood observed, turning the box in his hands. "Feels like quality craftsmanship. There doesn't seem to be a lock. Here we are." He found the catch and lifted the lid. The scream that erupted from the box was unlike anything Miss Marple had ever heard in 70-odd years of life. It was not mechanical, not the sound of a spring-loaded novelty or a child's toy, but unmistakably human, a woman's voice raised in absolute terror, raw and desperate and somehow amplified beyond what seemed possible from such a small container. The sound filled the village hall, echoing off the walls and seeming to vibrate in the very bones of everyone present. Several people cried out in shock. Mrs. Bantry dropped her handbag, and young Timothy Fletcher knocked over his chair as he jumped to his feet. But it was not the scream itself that would haunt the residents of St. Mary Mead in the weeks to come. It was what happened in the 3 seconds of stunned silence that followed as the echoes died away and everyone in the hall stared at Alistair Blackwood. He stood frozen, the opened box in his hands, his face a mask of shock and confusion. Then, slowly, his knees buckled and he collapsed to the floor, the wooden box clattering beside him as his body convulsed once and then lay still. Dr. Pembroke was on his feet immediately, pushing through the crowd to reach the fallen man. But even from her seat in the 3rd row, Miss Marple could see what the doctor would soon confirm. Alistair Blackwood was dead. In the chaos that followed, Mrs. Hartwell's shocked cries, Colonel Hartwell's attempts to restore order, the general confusion of people not knowing whether to flee or help, Miss Marple remained seated, her mild blue eyes taking in every detail. She noticed that the wooden box, now lying on its side, appeared to be empty. She observed that Timothy Fletcher had gone very pale and was staring not at the body, but at Miss Rosalind Hartwell. Most interestingly, she saw that Dr. Pembroke, after his initial examination of Blackwood, had glanced quickly toward his wife Margaret, who sat rigid in her chair, her face the color of chalk. "Heart attack, I should think," Dr. Pembroke announced, his voice professionally calm despite the circumstances. The shock of that, whatever that was, it must have been too much for him. But Miss Marple, who had seen many things in her long life, noticed something that the good doctor had apparently missed, a tiny puncture wound on Blackwood's neck, barely visible beneath his collar, and the faint, sweet smell that lingered around the fallen man. an odor she recognized from her gardening days as belonging to a particularly toxic variety of plant extract. The gift that screamed at midnight had indeed delivered death to St. Mary Mead, but Miss Marple suspected that the scream itself had been merely the performance, not the play. The immediate silence that followed Dr. Pembroke's pronouncement seemed to stretch like elastic, until Mrs. Hartwell's sharp intake of breath released the tension and the village hall erupted into controlled chaos. Colonel Hartwell, drawing upon his military training, began directing people away from the body with quiet authority, though Miss Marple noticed his hands trembled slightly as he helped his wife to a chair near the wall. "I don't understand it," Mrs. Hartwell kept repeating, her usual commanding presence diminished by genuine shock. It was just a charity auction. How could such a thing happen at a charity auction? The mysterious wooden box lay where it had fallen, its polished mahogany surface now seeming somehow malevolent in the harsh overhead lighting. Several villagers had gathered around it at a respectful distance, staring as if it might provide some explanation for the evening's tragedy, though no one seemed inclined to touch it. Young Timothy Fletcher had recovered sufficiently to right his overturned chair, but he remained standing, his mechanic's hands clasped tightly behind his back. His attention, Miss Marple observed, was still fixed on Miss Rosalind Hartwell, who sat with admirable composure despite her obvious pallor. Beside her, Patricia Wynne leaned close, whispering something urgent that caused Rosalind's gloved hand to tighten on her evening bag. "Did anyone recognize that voice?" Mrs. Bantry asked suddenly, her natural curiosity overcoming her shock. "The scream, I mean. It sounded so dreadfully real." A murmur of agreement rippled through the gathering. The scream had indeed possessed a quality that distinguished it from any mechanical contrivance, an emotional authenticity that spoke of genuine terror. "Perhaps some sort of gramophone mechanism," suggested Mrs. Worthington, though her voice carried little conviction, hidden inside the box somehow. Dr. Pembroke, who had been examining the fallen box from a careful distance, shook his head. "I can see no mechanism whatsoever. The box appears to be completely empty now, just polished wood and brass fittings." This revelation prompted another wave of nervous speculation. Miss Marple rose quietly from her seat and moved closer to the front, ostensibly to comfort Mrs. Hartwell, but actually to observe certain details that had caught her attention. As she approached, she caught fragments of whispered conversations that revealed the undercurrents of village life that rarely surfaced at charity auctions. "Always said there was something not quite right about Blackwood," muttered Mr. Jenkins, the postmaster. "Too much money, too few explanations about where it came from." Near the back of the hall, Patricia Wynne's urgent whisper reached Miss Marple's sharp ears. "You must be careful what you say when the police arrive. Remember what we discussed about keeping certain matters private." Most intriguing of all was a brief exchange between Dr. Pembroke and his wife Margaret, who had finally found her voice, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper. "Geoffrey, that voice, didn't it sound familiar to you?" The doctor's response was sharp, almost harsh. "Don't be ridiculous, Margaret. How could it sound familiar? It was obviously some sort of recording, some tasteless prank." But Miss Marple, with her keen ear for the subtleties of human speech, detected something in Dr. Pembroke's denial that suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as his wife. There had been a moment, just after the scream ended, when his face had shown not merely shock, but something approaching recognition. The arrival of P.C. Johnson interrupted these observations. The village constable, normally jovial, wore an expression of bewildered solemnity as he surveyed the scene. He was quickly followed by Inspector Slack from county headquarters, whose brisk efficiency Miss Marple remembered from previous encounters. "Right then," Inspector Slack announced, taking charge with his usual authority. "I'll need statements from everyone present, but first—" His gaze fell on the wooden box. "Someone can explain what the devil that thing is and how it managed to kill a man." As the inspector began his preliminary examination, Miss Marple found herself studying the faces around her with renewed interest. Someone in this hall had placed that box among the auction items, knowing it would eventually be opened in front of the entire village. Someone had wanted Alistair Blackwood to hear that particular scream, in that particular moment, with that particular result. The question was not merely who had done it, but why they had chosen such an elaborate and public method. In Miss Marple's considerable experience, murderers who staged their crimes so theatrically usually harbored very personal reasons for doing so. Inspector Slack's methodical nature asserted itself immediately as he took command of the scene. His first instruction to P.C. Johnson was to secure the hall doors, ensuring no one could leave until statements had been taken. His second was to examine the mysterious box that had somehow produced a scream capable of killing a man. "Right then," he announced, producing his notebook with practiced efficiency. "Mrs. Hartwell, I'll need to know exactly how these mystery parcels were collected and who had access to them before tonight." Mrs. Hartwell, rallying her organizational instincts despite her obvious distress, consulted her clipboard. The parcels were left at the post office throughout the week, as is traditional. Mr. Jenkins can confirm the procedure. We collected them this afternoon and brought them here for numbering. "That's correct," Jenkins confirmed, adjusting his spectacles nervously. "People drop them off at all hours, the whole point being anonymity for charitable giving. Sometimes I find them waiting on the doorstep when I open in the morning." Inspector Slack frowned as he examined the wooden box more closely, turning it in his hands with the same careful attention Blackwood had shown, though with considerably more caution. The interior was completely empty. No hidden compartments, no springs, no mechanical apparatus of any kind that could account for the terrifying sound they had all heard. "Most peculiar," he muttered. "Dr. Pembroke, you're absolutely certain about the cause of death?" There was the briefest hesitation before the doctor replied, a pause so slight that most people missed it entirely. Miss Marple, however, noted it with interest. "Heart failure brought on by severe shock," Dr. Pembroke stated with professional authority. "At his age, with the stress of that sound, it's entirely plausible." Miss Marple had positioned herself near enough to observe both the inspector's examination and the reactions of those waiting to be questioned. She noticed that Margaret Pembroke's hands were trembling as she clutched her handbag, her eyes darting between her husband and the wooden box as if expecting one or the other to provide some explanation for the impossible. As Inspector Slack began taking statements, Miss Marple made her own quiet observations. Around the brass catch of the box, she detected the faintest smear of something that had not quite dried, barely visible unless one knew what to look for. More intriguing still was a sweet, almost almond-like scent that lingered near where Blackwood had fallen, reminiscent of certain plant extracts she remembered from her gardening days. Timothy Fletcher's statement proved particularly revealing, though perhaps not in the way he intended. "It weren't a gramophone," he said with the confidence of professional expertise. "I'd have heard the motor running, and there's no battery compartment in that box, not one that would fit any mechanism capable of producing sound." This technical assessment seemed to frustrate Inspector Slack, who clearly preferred mysteries with mechanical solutions. Miss Marple, however, found it fascinating. If the box contained no device, yet had produced that terrifying scream, then the solution lay elsewhere entirely. When Margaret Pembroke was questioned, her carefully controlled composure began to crack. She described the evening in measured tones until the inspector asked about the scream itself. "It was horrible," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "So full of terror, it reminded me of—" She stopped abruptly, glancing at her husband with something approaching panic. "Reminded you of what, Mrs. Pembroke?" Inspector Slack pressed. Dr. Pembroke intervened smoothly, his hand closing over his wife's. "Margaret has a very sensitive nature, Inspector. The shock of hearing such a sound, seeing a man die so suddenly, it's quite understandable that she might imagine similarities to other distressing experiences. But Miss Marple, with her lifetime of observing human nature, recognized the difference between general distress and specific memory. Margaret Pembroke had heard that voice before, under circumstances that still haunted her. Patricia Wynne's statement was notably detailed, perhaps too much so. She offered observations about the other attendees that seemed designed to deflect attention from herself and Rosalind. Mr. Blackwood seemed quite pleased with his purchase, she noted. Almost triumphant, I thought, as if he knew he was getting something valuable. This comment drew sharp looks from several people, particularly Timothy Fletcher, who had been outbid for the fatal box. Miss Marple wondered if Patricia realized how her observation might be interpreted, or if she was deliberately casting suspicion elsewhere. As the questioning continued, Miss Marple made another discovery that the inspector had missed. Examining the box's interior while Slack was distracted by statements, she noticed traces of what appeared to be wax around the edges, barely visible residue that suggested the box had once contained something that was no longer there. Rosalind Hartwell maintained her composure throughout her questioning, revealing little beyond appropriate shock at the tragedy. Yet Miss Marple observed the way Timothy Fletcher's attention remained fixed on her, and how Patricia Wynne seemed to be coaching her responses with subtle gestures and meaningful glances. By the time the preliminary statements were completed, Inspector Slack appeared no closer to understanding how the impossible had occurred. The box remained stubbornly empty and mechanically innocent, offering no explanation for its deadly secret. But Miss Marple had begun to form a theory that had nothing to do with mechanical devices or gramophone recordings. Someone had wanted Alistair Blackwood to hear that particular voice, raised in terror, and they had been clever enough to ensure their method would seem impossible to detect. The question was not how they had done it, but why that specific scream had been worth committing murder to deliver. As the church clock struck 9 and Inspector Slack prepared to release the witnesses with stern warnings not to leave the village, Patricia Wynne approached Miss Marple with studied casualness. "I should very much like to speak with you privately, Miss Marple," she said in an undertone. "There are certain matters that might be relevant to tonight's tragedy, but which require discretion in their discussion." Miss Marple inclined her head graciously, as if agreeing to nothing more significant than sharing a recipe. But in her mind, the pieces of the puzzle were beginning to arrange themselves into a pattern that suggested tonight's performance had been years in the making, and that the scream which killed Alistair Blackwood was not a recording at all, but a memory, finally given voice. Patricia Wynne's request for private conversation came as Inspector Slack dismissed the last of the witnesses, his frustration evident in the sharp way he snapped his notebook closed. The village hall had taken on the hollow quality that follows dramatic events, with shadows seeming longer and the ordinary fixtures, the folded chairs, the abandoned tea-urn appearing somehow accusatory in the harsh electric light. Miss Marple followed Patricia to the small ante-room behind the stage, where extra chairs were stacked and a tin of digestive biscuits sat forgotten on a windowsill. Patricia closed the door with careful precision, then remained standing as if sitting might commit her to revelations she wasn't entirely prepared to make. "I find myself in a rather difficult position, Miss Marple," she began, her usual composure showing hairline cracks. "There are things about tonight that might be misunderstood if they came to Inspector Slack's attention without proper context." Miss Marple settled herself comfortably, her knitting bag at her feet and her expression one of mild, encouraging interest. "Context can be so important," she agreed gently. "People do tend to jump to conclusions when they don't have the complete picture." Patricia's hands twisted together, a gesture that spoke of genuine distress beneath her controlled exterior. Mr. Blackwood was not quite the respectable newcomer he appeared to be. He had a talent for discovering things about people. Private matters, family histories, small embarrassments that most would prefer to keep buried. He seemed to collect such information the way other people collect stamps. This revelation aligned with Miss Marple's own observations of human nature. In her experience, people who hoarded secrets about others usually did so for purposes that were rarely benevolent. "And did he perhaps discover something about Miss Rosalind that concerned you?" He had been pressing her to sell a piece of land, nothing valuable, just a small parcel with a public footpath crossing it. When she refused, he began making inquiries about her family's estate, particularly her mother's side. He hinted that there might be irregularities in the inheritance that could prove awkward if they came to official attention. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Blackmail by suggestion was often more effective than direct threats, as it allowed the victim to imagine consequences far worse than anything the blackmailer might actually accomplish. Most unpleasant for Miss Rosalind. Indeed, but there's something else. Patricia paused, glancing toward the door as if to ensure their privacy. Fortnight ago, Blackwood showed Rosalind a curious item he had received. A small novelty card that, when opened, produced a brief, rather horrible scream. He claimed it had been sent anonymously and found it amusing. Rosalind was quite disturbed by it, though she tried not to show her reaction. This information sent a small chill through Miss Marple's understanding of the evening's events. Someone had been practicing, testing their method on a smaller scale before the grand performance at the charity auction. How very peculiar. Did Mr. Blackwood seem to recognize the sound? If he did, he gave no sign of it. But I noticed that Mrs. Pembroke was present when he demonstrated the card. She'd come to discuss some village matter with Rosalind. Her reaction was quite pronounced. She went quite pale and excused herself almost immediately. Miss Marple filed this detail away with growing interest. Margaret Pembroke's distress at tonight's scream had been notable, but if she'd had a similar reaction to an earlier, smaller version, it suggested something more than general sensitivity to unpleasant sounds. When they rejoined the main hall, most of the villagers had departed, leaving only the core participants in the evening's drama. Inspector Slack was conferring with P.C. Johnson over the custody of the mysterious box, his expression suggesting deep frustration with its stubborn refusal to yield mechanical explanations. Dr. Pembroke stood near the door with his wife, their quiet conversation marked by the sort of urgent undertones that suggested private concerns rather than general shock. Miss Marple positioned herself where she could observe without seeming to do so, a skill refined over decades of village life. She noticed that Timothy Fletcher lingered near the dismantled auction table, ostensibly helping Colonel Hartwell, but actually watching Rosalind with the sort of hopeless devotion that made young men do foolish things. His earlier eagerness to bid on the fatal box, combined with his obvious romantic interest, would certainly make him an attractive suspect in Inspector Slack's eyes. But Miss Marple's attention was drawn more to the subtle interactions between the other participants. Dr. Pembroke's protective hovering over his wife suggested knowledge of some specific vulnerability rather than general husbandly concern. Margaret Pembroke herself moved with the careful precision of someone fighting to maintain control, her earlier recognition of the scream clearly having shaken her more profoundly than a simple case of nerves could explain. As the group prepared to leave, Miss Marple made her own careful examination of the area around where the box had fallen. The sweet, almond-like scent that had caught her attention earlier still lingered faintly, and she was able to detect traces of what appeared to be wax residue on the floor, barely visible unless one knew what to look for. Someone had prepared the box very carefully, ensuring that its contents would be perfectly preserved until the moment of opening. The walk home through the frost-touched village provided opportunity for reflection. Patricia's revelations about Blackwood's character painted him as a man who made enemies through systematic manipulation rather than dramatic confrontation. Such behavior created the sort of slow-burning resentments that could explode into violence given the right catalyst. But the elaborate nature of tonight's murder suggested something more complex than simple revenge. The theatrical presentation, the public setting, the use of what appeared to be a recorded scream from someone's past, all pointed to a killer who wanted not just Blackwood's death, but his specific psychological torment in the moments before that death. Miss Marple paused at her garden gate, looking back toward the village hall where a single light still burned in Inspector Slack's temporary headquarters. Somewhere in the quiet streets around her walked a murderer who had spent considerable time and effort crafting the perfect weapon, a voice from the past that could kill with the precision of any poison. The question was not just who had done it, but whose voice had been preserved in that polished wooden box, and why hearing it had been worth committing murder to ensure. As she prepared for bed, Miss Marple reflected that the dead sometimes spoke more eloquently than the living, especially when someone took the trouble to give them voice again. In the distance, the church clock chimed 11, and St. Mary Mead settled into an uneasy sleep, haunted by the echo of a scream that had somehow reached across time to claim its victim. The morning after the tragedy dawned grey and subdued over St. Mary Mead, the kind of December day that seemed to mirror the village's collective mood. Frost had settled on every surface like a delicate shroud, and the usual cheerful bustle of Sunday morning preparations was replaced by the hushed conversations and furtive glances that follow violent death into peaceful communities. Miss Marple, making her customary early walk to check her winter garden, observed how curtains twitched more frequently than usual, and how neighbors who normally exchanged hearty greetings now offered only solemn nods. The post office, when she arrived for her weekly pension, buzzed with the sort of restrained excitement that accompanies genuine scandal. Mr. Jenkins, normally unflappable in his official duties, was visibly agitated as he sorted through the morning's deliveries with unusual clumsiness. 23 years I've been managing the charity collection system, he muttered, dropping the same bundle of letters twice before achieving a stable arrangement. Never had anything like this happen. Makes a man wonder what else might have passed through here without proper scrutiny. Miss Marple accepted her pension with gracious patience, noting how Jenkins's hands trembled slightly as he counted the notes. "I'm sure you couldn't have anticipated such a thing, Mr. Jenkins. After all, the parcel appeared quite innocent from the outside." "That's precisely what troubles me," Jenkins continued, lowering his voice as Mrs. Worthington's approach became audible through the shop's thin walls. "I've been thinking about it all night, and I remember now. That burgundy parcel wasn't delivered in the usual manner. Found it sitting directly on my counter Tuesday morning when I opened, neat as you please, with a note saying it was for the charity auction. Thought it odd at the time, someone having a key or slipping it through the slot, but didn't dwell on the matter. This revelation carried significant implications. Someone had taken considerable care to ensure the deadly package reached its destination without being observed in the act of delivery, a precaution that suggested meticulous planning rather than impulsive action. Miss Marple's next destination was the stationer's, where Miss Pratt presided over her domain with the sort of proprietary pride that comes from being the village's sole source of quality writing materials. At the mention of burgundy wrapping paper and silver ribbon, Miss Pratt's eyes brightened with professional satisfaction. "I've been the only establishment in the village to stock that particular shade this season," she declared with evident pride. "Very elegant for special presentations. Had it specially ordered in November. Only 3 customers purchased it. Mrs. Worthington for her godchildren's Christmas parcels, Miss Patricia Wynne for Miss Hartwell's gifts, and Mrs. Pembroke for her church charitable contributions." The significance of this information was not lost on Miss Marple. 3 women, each with potential connections to both Blackwood and the circumstances surrounding the fatal auction, had purchased the distinctive wrapping materials. The investigation was beginning to narrow its focus in ways that Inspector Slack's mechanical theories could not accommodate. Her subsequent visit to the Pembroke residence, ostensibly to inquire after Margaret's recovery from the previous evening's shock, proved most illuminating. Dr. Pembroke answered the door himself, his professional composure intact despite obvious fatigue and what appeared to be a recent burn on his wrist, hastily bandaged. "Miss Marple, how thoughtful of you to call. Margaret is resting, but I'm certain she would appreciate your concern." The drawing-room bore signs of a restless night. Newspapers scattered rather than neatly folded. teacups abandoned unwashed, and an overall atmosphere of domestic disruption that suggested more than ordinary grief. Through the partially open surgery door, Miss Marple glimpsed medical texts lying open on the desk, as if the doctor had spent the small hours researching something specific and urgent. Most intriguingly, on the mantelpiece, partially concealed behind a wedding photograph, stood a small gramophone recording cylinder, the old-fashioned type used for making personal voice recordings. It was positioned as if someone had placed it there hastily and forgotten to store it properly. When Margaret Pembroke appeared, her composure was clearly maintained through considerable effort. Her face was pale but determined, her hands clasped tightly to prevent their trembling from becoming obvious. "Miss Marple, how kind of you to visit. I wanted to thank you for your calming presence last evening during all that dreadful confusion." "Not at all, my dear. I do hope you're feeling somewhat recovered this morning." Margaret's smile was wan but brave. "Much better, thank you. Geoffrey assures me it was simply the shock of hearing such a terrible sound so unexpectedly." She paused, then added with apparent casualness, "I suppose the police will eventually discover how such a recording was managed. These modern devices can be quite sophisticated." But Miss Marple had caught the slight hesitation in Margaret's voice and noticed how both husband and wife avoided looking directly toward the mantelpiece where the recording cylinder sat in its inadequate concealment. In her extensive experience of human nature, she had learned that people who protested normalcy with such vehemence were usually defending against accusations that hadn't yet been made. "Mrs. Pembroke," Miss Marple said gently, settling back in her chair with the air of someone prepared for a longer conversation, "I couldn't help but notice your particularly strong reaction to that dreadful scream last evening. Sometimes shock can make us imagine connections that aren't really there, but the human mind does tend to search for familiar patterns, even in the most distressing circumstances." Margaret's carefully maintained composure began to crack at the edges. "It was the tone, Miss Marple, the sheer, raw terror in it. It brought back such vivid memories of another scream I heard years ago, the night Alice died." The name fell into the quiet room like a stone into still water, creating ripples of significance that Miss Marple immediately recognized. Alice Hartwell, Rosalind's older sister, who had tragically drowned in the village pond nearly 20 years ago. The official verdict had been accidental death, but Miss Marple recalled the whispers that had lingered like smoke in the village's collective memory. "Alice Hartwell," Miss Marple murmured thoughtfully. "Such a beautiful young woman, and so full of life. Her death was a terrible loss for the entire village." "She was extraordinary," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible now. "But that night, I was walking home late from a parish meeting, taking the path by the pond, when I heard it. A scream exactly like the one we heard last evening. I ran toward the sound, of course, but by the time I reached the water's edge, there was nothing, just ripples on the surface and the most dreadful silence." "And you reported this to the authorities at the time?" Margaret's hands twisted together in her lap. "I tried to, but they said it must have been my imagination, the wind through the trees, an owl, the shock of finding her body, making me remember things that hadn't really happened. Geoffrey convinced me that pursuing the matter would only cause more pain for the family, and wouldn't bring Alice back." Miss Marple nodded with gentle understanding, but her mind was rapidly connecting the threads of information. "And Mr. Blackwood, did he ever mention Alice to you during his time in the village?" Fear flickered across Margaret's face like candlelight in a draught. "He came to see me just last week, claiming to be researching local history for a book he was writing. But his questions were very specific. About Alice, about that night, about the exact nature of what I had heard. He had a way of looking at one, a knowing expression that made me feel completely exposed. And then he showed me that horrible little card that made the same sound." The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to arrange themselves in Miss Marple's mind, with the inexorable logic of truth finally emerging from shadow. Blackwood, the collector of secrets, had somehow discovered not only the truth about Alice Hartwell's death, but had managed to preserve or recreate the very sound that Margaret had heard that night 20 years ago. The recording cylinder on the mantelpiece, the wax residue in the wooden box, the sweet almond scent that lingered, all pointed to someone who had not merely killed Alistair Blackwood, but had done so using the voice of the dead as their weapon. As Miss Marple prepared to take her leave, she reflected that the gift that screamed at midnight was indeed a voice from the past, carefully preserved and deliberately delivered to destroy not just Blackwood, but anyone who recognized its chilling authenticity. Someone in St. Mary Mead had been carrying the burden of Alice Hartwell's death for 20 years, and Alistair Blackwood's investigations had finally brought that secret close enough to the surface to kill for. The question now was not merely who had committed murder, but who had been present on that long-ago night when Alice Hartwell died, and what they had done that was worth preserving a dead woman's scream to keep hidden. Miss Marple's walk home from the Pembrokes carried the weight of revelation, each step bringing greater clarity to the puzzle that had begun with a scream in the night. Margaret's confession about Alice Hartwell had transformed what appeared to be an impossible murder into something far more sinister, a crime rooted in secrets that had festered for 20 years, finally erupting into deadly violence when Alistair Blackwood's investigations threatened to expose them. The village hall stood quiet in the morning light, its doors propped open for the coroner's men who were completing their examination of the scene. P.C. Johnson, grateful for any semblance of normalcy, touched his helmet respectfully when Miss Marple approached with her customary apologetic smile. "I believe I may have left my reading glasses," she said with the sort of vague concern that made people eager to help elderly ladies, "just near where I was sitting last evening." Inside, the hall retained that peculiar atmosphere of places where dramatic events have occurred, ordinary objects seeming somehow charged with significance. Miss Marple made her way to the area around the auction table, her sharp eyes taking in details that others had overlooked in the confusion of the previous evening. Near where the burgundy parcel had been displayed, she discovered a translucent flake clinging to the wooden floor, beeswax by its consistency and faint honey scent. A short curl of silver ribbon lay against the table leg, its end cut with a precision that suggested careful preparation rather than hasty wrapping. Most intriguingly, the brass rail along the stage showed traces of what appeared to be oil and wax residue, as if someone had steadied nervous hands there while preparing something delicate and crucial. Mrs. Hartwell arrived as Miss Marple was completing her examination, her clipboard clutched like a talisman against the chaos that had disrupted her perfectly organized charity auction. Despite her obvious distress, her organizational instincts remained intact, and she was eager to discuss the practical details of the evening's arrangements. "The parcels were numbered as they arrived," she explained, consulting her notes with determined precision. "Rosalind and Patricia helped with the ribbon work. Such neat hands they both have. Patricia particularly insisted that number 12 should have its ribbon crossed twice to ensure it stayed secure during handling." This detail sent a small chill through Miss Marple's understanding. Someone had taken special care with the fatal parcel, ensuring it would remain perfectly sealed until the moment of opening. The preparation had been meticulous, suggesting not impulsive action, but carefully planned execution. Her next destination was Gossington Hall, where Mrs. Bantry's legendary memory for village gossip might provide the historical context that was becoming increasingly crucial to understanding the present tragedy. Mrs. Bantry, delighted to have a visitor who appreciated the finer points of local history, was easily drawn into reminiscences of Alice Hartwell. "Such a beautiful girl," Mrs. Bantry sighed over her teacup. "Full of life, perhaps too much so for a quiet village like ours. She had quite a few admirers, you know. There were whispers at the time about a secret engagement, something terribly romantic and scandalous involving a married man. The sort of thing that would have caused enormous upheaval if it had become public knowledge." The implications of this revelation were staggering. A secret engagement with a married man would have provided multiple motives for murder 20 years, ego, and even more compelling reasons to kill anyone who threatened to expose it in the present. If Blackwood had discovered not only the truth about Alice's death, but also the identity of her secret lover, he would have possessed information capable of destroying lives and reputations. As Miss Marple walked home through the frost-touched village, the technical aspects of the murder method began to crystallize in her mind. The gramophone cylinder she had observed on the Pembroke's mantelpiece, the wax residue in the wooden box, the sweet almond scent that had lingered around Blackwood's body, all pointed to an ingenious device that had preserved Alice's final scream and delivered it with deadly precision 20 years later. Someone had made a recording of that terrible night by the pond, perhaps accidentally, perhaps with deliberate intent. They had kept it hidden for 2 decades until Blackwood's investigations forced them to use it as a weapon. The wooden box had been carefully prepared with a mechanism, likely involving heated wax and chemical reaction, that would release the recorded scream at the moment of opening, while simultaneously delivering a fatal dose of poison through a concealed needle or similar device. The murderer was someone who had been present on the night Alice died. Someone who possessed both the technical knowledge to create such an elaborate weapon and the emotional investment to preserve a dead woman's voice as evidence of their crime. Most crucially, they were someone whose life would be destroyed if the truth about Alice Hartwell's secret engagement ever became known. As the church clock chimed noon, Miss Marple reflected that the gift that screamed at midnight was indeed a voice from the grave. But it was also the confession of someone who had been carrying the burden of murder for 20 years and who had finally found the courage to let the dead speak their truth, even if that truth came wrapped in another killing. The question now was not merely who had killed Alistair Blackwood, but who had loved Alice Hartwell enough to preserve her final words, and what secret was worth committing murder twice to protect. Inspector Slack's return to Miss Marple's cottage that afternoon carried with it the weight of genuine breakthrough, though his expression suggested a man still grappling with the implications of what he had discovered. He accepted her offer of tea with the distracted air of someone whose orderly world of evidence and procedure had been thoroughly disrupted by the morning's investigations. The pathologist's preliminary findings confirm our suspicions. He began without preamble, consulting his notebook with unusual intensity. Alistair Blackwood died from acute cyanide poisoning, delivered through a puncture wound so fine it was nearly invisible. The sweet almond scent you detected was indeed hydrocyanic acid, concentrated to a lethal degree. But here's what troubles me, Miss Marple. The wound shows signs of having been made by something that dissolved or was absorbed after delivery. No ordinary needle could accomplish such a thing. Miss Marple set down her teacup with careful precision, her mind already racing ahead to the implications. A dissolving delivery mechanism suggested not merely premeditation, but sophisticated knowledge of both chemistry and anatomy, the sort of expertise that pointed toward someone with medical or scientific training. Most ingenious, she murmured thoughtfully. And the wooden box itself? Completely innocent, as we suspected. But that led us to examine the hall more thoroughly, and what we found. Slack paused, as if still struggling to believe his own discoveries. Miss Marple, would you accompany me back to the village hall? There's something you need to see. The afternoon light slanting through the hall's windows revealed details that had been obscured by the previous evening's confusion and artificial lighting. Inspector Slack led her directly to the area behind the makeshift stage, where the accumulated detritus of decades of village productions created perfect concealment for anyone who knew where to look. P.C. Johnson discovered this while conducting a systematic search, Slack explained, directing her attention to what appeared to be nothing more than a folded curtain draped over an old chair. But when he lifted the fabric, Miss Marple found herself looking at one of the most ingenious murder weapons she had ever encountered. The device was compact and beautifully crafted, a small phonograph mechanism no larger than a biscuit tin. its brass fittings polished to a warm glow despite its concealment. A wax recording cylinder sat mounted on the spindle, and from the mechanism extended a length of fine black thread that disappeared into the shadows toward the main stage area. The thread was attached to the ribbon on a parcel number 12, Slack explained, his voice carrying a mixture of admiration and revulsion for the killer's ingenuity. When Blackwood opened the box and pulled the ribbon, it activated this device. The scream came from here, not from the box at all. Quite brilliant, really, if one can admire such things. Miss Marple examined the cylinder more closely, noting the careful inscription on its paper label, a single letter, A, written in faded ink. The implications were staggering. Someone had preserved Alice Hartwell's final scream for 20 years, waiting for the perfect moment to use it as a weapon. But the poison delivery system, she observed, that required proximity to the victim. Someone had to be close enough to administer the fatal dose while everyone's attention was focused on the impossible scream. As if summoned by her observation, Timothy Fletcher appeared in the hall's doorway, his face bearing the pallor of someone who had spent a sleepless night wrestling with difficult knowledge. His approach was hesitant but determined, like a man who had finally resolved to unburden himself of secrets too heavy to carry alone. "Inspector, Miss Marple," he began, his mechanic's hands twisting his cap into an unrecognizable shape. "I've been thinking about what happened last night, and there's something I need to tell you. About the wrapping on that parcel, I'd seen it before." The revelation that followed painted a picture of growing complexity and danger. Timothy's account of recognizing the distinctive burgundy paper and silver ribbon from Rosalind Hartwell's sitting room, combined with his observations of burned correspondence and removed photographs, suggested someone desperately trying to eliminate evidence of connections to the past. "She was frightened, Miss Marple," Timothy continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "When I mentioned the wrapping, she went quite pale and made some excuse about old letters she was disposing of. But I saw her through the window afterward, burning papers in the fireplace with a sort of urgency that spoke of genuine terror." Inspector Slack was making rapid notes, but Miss Marple found herself thinking beyond the immediate implications of Rosalind's suspicious behavior. The technical sophistication of the murder weapon, the careful preservation of Alice's final scream, the elaborate staging of the crime, all pointed to someone with both the emotional investment to carry such a burden for 20 years and the knowledge necessary to transform it into a weapon. As they prepared to leave the hall, Miss Marple made one final observation that would prove crucial to understanding the full scope of the crime. Near the base of the hidden phonograph, partially concealed beneath accumulated dust, lay a small glass vial with traces of a crystalline residue that caught the afternoon light like scattered diamonds. "Prussic acid crystals," she murmured, recognizing the substance from her extensive reading on gardening and its more dangerous applications. "Dissolved in a carrier that would be absorbed by the skin within moments of contact. Someone has been very thorough in their preparations." The walk back through the village carried new weight as Miss Marple reflected on how the threads of the mystery were finally weaving together into a recognizable pattern. The gift that screamed at midnight was indeed a voice from the grave, but it was also the confession of someone who had been carrying the burden of murder for 20 years and who had finally found both the courage and the means to let the dead speak their truth. The question was no longer merely who had killed Alistair Blackwood, but who had loved Alice Hartwell enough to preserve her final words as evidence, and what secret was worth committing murder twice to protect. As the church clock chimed 4 and the December afternoon began its early descent toward darkness, Miss Marple knew that the final confrontation was approaching rapidly, and that someone in St. Mary Mead was preparing for whatever desperate measures would be necessary to ensure that the truth remained buried with the dead. The mechanical ingenuity of the crime spoke of careful planning and technical knowledge, but the emotional core of it, the preservation of a young woman's dying scream, spoke of something far more personal and infinitely more dangerous than mere revenge. Someone had been waiting 20 years for the perfect moment to give Alice Hartwell's voice the power to kill. And now that the weapon had been used, the question remained whether its creator would be content with a single victim, or whether the truth about that long-ago night by the pond was worth killing again. To protect, evening settled over St. Mary Mead with the particular weight that follows momentous discoveries, casting long shadows across the village lanes and lending an air of expectancy to the frost-touched gardens. Miss Marple had spent the remainder of the afternoon in quiet contemplation, allowing the implications of Inspector Slack's findings to settle in her mind like sediment in still water. The hidden phonograph with its precious cargo, Alice Hartwell's preserved final scream, had transformed the investigation from a puzzle of mechanical impossibility into something far more sinister, a crime rooted in 20 years of carefully guarded secrets. Her decision to call upon the Pembrokes that evening was made with the deliberate precision of a chess player contemplating a crucial move. The burnt letter fragment Timothy Fletcher had discovered, combined with Margaret's obvious recognition of Alice's recorded voice, painted a picture that required careful verification through direct observation of their reactions. Timothy had appeared at her garden gate just as the church clock struck 6. His mechanic's hands still bearing traces of ash from his afternoon's work at Hartwell Lodge. His discovery had been accidental. Patricia Wynne had asked him to clear the sitting-room grate, claiming the chimney was smoking badly, but the charred fragment he'd salvaged spoke volumes about someone's desperate attempt to destroy evidence. "I shouldn't have taken it, Miss Marple," he confessed, producing the carefully preserved scrap from his coat pocket. "But when I saw those words, 'Dearest G,' and lower down, 'the pond,' well, it seemed important somehow." The fragment was indeed significant. The flowing feminine handwriting, browned by heat but still legible, bore the unmistakable characteristics of correspondence from an earlier era. The signature corner that remained, "Al," left little doubt about its author, while the salutation suggested an intimacy that would have been scandalous if revealed 20 years ago. "You did quite right to preserve it, Timothy," Miss Marple assured him gently. "Sometimes the truth insists on surviving, even when people try very hard to burn it away." Armed with this concrete evidence, Miss Marple made her way to the Pembroke residence, where the drawing-room windows glowed with the warm light of domestic tranquility that often concealed the darkest secrets. Dr. Pembroke received her with professional courtesy, though she noted the careful way he positioned himself between her and his wife, as if protecting Margaret from unwelcome scrutiny. "Miss Marple, how thoughtful of you to call," he said, his voice carrying the measured tone he might use with a particularly challenging patient. "Margaret has been somewhat unsettled since last evening's tragedy. The shock of witnessing such violence has been quite overwhelming for her sensitive constitution." Margaret Pembroke sat in her customary chair by the fire, her hands folded with the sort of rigid control that suggested considerable effort to maintain composure. The gramophone cylinder Miss Marple had observed on her previous visit was no longer visible on the mantelpiece, though a faint rectangular outline in the dust marked where it had recently stood. "I do hope you're feeling somewhat recovered, my dear," Miss Marple said, settling herself comfortably and accepting the offered tea with gracious appreciation. "Such shocking events can bring back the most distressing memories, particularly for someone with your sensitive nature." The casual mention of memories produced an immediate reaction, a slight tightening around Margaret's eyes and a quick, almost involuntary glance toward her husband. Dr. Pembroke's response was equally telling. His hand moved protectively to rest on the back of his wife's chair, a gesture that spoke of long practice in shielding her from difficult questions. "Inspector Slack made the most interesting discovery today," Miss Marple continued conversationally, her knitting needles clicking with gentle rhythm. "That ingenious phonograph device hidden behind the stage. Such technical sophistication suggests someone with considerable knowledge of both mechanical devices and chemical compounds. The poison delivery system, in particular, required expertise that few people in our village would possess. Dr. Pembroke's professional interest was immediately evident, though he attempted to disguise it as casual curiosity. Indeed, what sort of mechanism could accomplish such a thing? Something involving prussic acid crystals, dissolved in a carrier that would be absorbed through the skin within moments. Quite brilliant, really, if one can admire such deadly ingenuity. The inspector believes it required someone with medical or chemical training to devise such a precise delivery method. The effect of this revelation was subtle but unmistakable. Margaret's teacup trembled slightly in its saucer, while her husband's face assumed the carefully neutral expression that medical professionals cultivate when discussing sensitive matters. Most tellingly, neither seemed surprised by the technical details, a reaction that suggested prior knowledge rather than shocked discovery. But the recording itself was perhaps even more remarkable, Miss Marple continued, her voice maintaining its gentle conversational tone. A wax cylinder, inscribed with a single letter, A, quite clearly Alice Hartwell's voice, preserved from that terrible night 20 years ago. Margaret, you mentioned hearing a similar scream on the night Alice died. How extraordinary that someone should have captured that exact sound. The carefully maintained facade finally cracked. Margaret's face went ashen, her hands gripping the chair arms with white-knuckled intensity. Please, she whispered, her voice barely audible. It's too painful to discuss. Geoffrey has always said it was my imagination. The shock of finding her body making me remember things that couldn't have happened. Nonsense, Margaret, Dr. Pembroke interjected sharply, his protective instincts overriding his professional discretion. We've discussed this repeatedly. The mind plays tricks under extreme duress. What you thought you heard was simply... But the mind also remembers with perfect clarity. Miss Marple interrupted gently, her mild blue eyes fixed on Margaret's anguished face. Particularly sounds that carry such emotional significance. One might even recognize the voice. Despite the passage of years, after all, Alice had such a distinctive way of speaking, didn't she? Especially when she was frightened or distressed. The question hung in the air like a delicate spider's web, trembling with significance. Margaret Pembroke's composure finally shattered completely, her hand flying to her mouth as if to prevent words from escaping. But it was Dr. Pembroke's reaction that proved most revealing, the look of a man whose carefully constructed defenses were crumbling beyond repair. Before either could respond, the sound of hurried footsteps on the front path interrupted the tense tableau. P.C. Johnson appeared at the drawing-room window, his face flushed with exertion and obvious distress. Dr. Pembroke admitted him with visible reluctance, clearly preferring to continue the conversation without official witnesses. Begging your pardon, Doctor, Miss Marple, Johnson panted, still catching his breath from his rapid journey. But there's been a development. Someone's broken into the parish office and made off with that phonograph cylinder. Left everything else untouched, just took the recording and disappeared. The news struck the room like a physical blow. Margaret Pembroke uttered a small cry of distress, while her husband's face assumed the grayish pallor of someone confronting inevitable disaster. Miss Marple, however, received the information with the sort of thoughtful calm that suggested she had been expecting exactly such a development. How very interesting, she murmured, her knitting needles never pausing in their steady rhythm. Someone was quite determined to reclaim that particular piece of evidence. I wonder if they realized that the truth it contained had already served its purpose, that Alice's voice had finally spoken after 20 years of silence. As P.C. Johnson departed to continue his investigation, Miss Marple prepared to take her leave, but not before delivering one final, gentle observation that would haunt the Pembroke household through the long night ahead. You know, she said, gathering her knitting with unhurried precision, I've always found it remarkable how the past refuses to stay buried, no matter how carefully we try to cover it. Some secrets have a way of demanding acknowledgement, even when that acknowledgement comes at a terrible price. Alice Hartwell was such a vibrant young woman, full of dreams and plans that were cut tragically short. I imagined she had many secrets of her own, particularly regarding matters of the heart. The words were delivered with Miss Marple's characteristic gentleness, but their impact was devastating. As she walked home through the frost-touched village streets, she reflected that the gift that screamed at midnight had indeed delivered its message with perfect clarity. Someone in St. Mary Mead had been carrying the burden of Alice Hartwell's death for 20 years, and Alistair Blackwood's investigations had finally brought that secret close enough to the surface to kill for. The theft of the recording cylinder suggested desperation rather than confidence, a final attempt to destroy evidence that had already accomplished its deadly purpose. But Miss Marple knew, with the certainty that comes from a lifetime of observing human nature, that the truth about that long-ago night by the pond was now too close to the surface to be buried again. Tomorrow would bring the final confrontation, and with it, the complete unraveling of secrets that had shaped and destroyed lives across 2 decades of carefully maintained silence. In the distance, the church clock chimed 9, and St. Mary Mead settled into an uneasy sleep, haunted by the knowledge that somewhere in its quiet streets walked someone who had killed twice to protect a secret that was no longer worth the price of its preservation. The morning brought with it the sort of crystalline clarity that often follows emotional storms, and Miss Marple awoke with the complete certainty that the final pieces of the puzzle were about to fall into place. The theft of the recording cylinder had been an act of desperation rather than calculation, revealing more about the thief's state of mind than any amount of careful questioning might have accomplished. As she prepared her morning tea, she reflected on how the truth about Alice Hartwell's death had been hiding in plain sight for 20 years, protected by the very respectability that should have exposed it. Inspector Slack arrived before she had finished her first cup, his usual brisk efficiency tempered by the sort of frustrated exhaustion that comes from pursuing leads that seem to dissolve upon examination. The theft had complicated his investigation considerably, though Miss Marple suspected it had actually simplified the path to truth by forcing the guilty party into precipitous action. "We've conducted a thorough search of every likely hiding place," he reported, accepting her offer of fresh tea with the gratitude of a man who had spent the night pursuing shadows. "Whoever took that cylinder knew exactly what they were looking for and where to find it. But here's the curious thing, Miss Marple. They left behind something almost as valuable in their haste." He produced from his coat pocket a small leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age and its binding worn smooth by years of handling. "Found it tucked behind where the phonograph mechanism had been concealed, as if someone had hidden it there for safekeeping and forgotten to retrieve it with the cylinder." Miss Marple accepted the journal with the reverence due to objects that carry the weight of human secrets. The handwriting that filled its pages was unmistakably feminine, flowing and elegant despite the obvious emotional distress that had guided the pen across many of the entries. The dates ranged across several months in 1904, culminating in entries from just weeks before Alice Hartwell's tragic death. The revelations contained within those faded pages confirmed her growing suspicions about the true nature of the tragedy that had haunted St. Mary Mead for 2 decades. Alice's secret engagement was documented in passionate detail, but the identity of her lover carried implications that reached far beyond simple scandal into the realm of devastating social and professional destruction. "My dearest Geoffrey grows more desperate with each passing day," one entry read, the ink slightly smeared as if by tears. "He speaks constantly of leaving Margaret, of taking me away from this village where our love must remain hidden. But I fear he lacks the courage for such decisive action. His medical practice, his reputation, his standing in the community, all would be forfeit if our relationship became known." The journal went on to document meetings by the village pond, promises of marriage that Dr. Geoffrey Pembroke seemed increasingly unable to fulfill, and Alice's growing desperation as she realized the man she loved might never find the strength to choose her over his established life. "He came to me last evening in such a state of agitation. The final entry read, dated just 2 days before Alice's death. Margaret has grown suspicious, and he fears exposure will destroy not only his marriage but his medical career. He begged me to be patient, to wait until he could find a way to manage the situation without scandal. But I can wait no longer. I have told him that I will speak to Margaret myself if he does not act by week's end. Miss Marple closed the journal with gentle finality, her mind already constructing the sequence of events that had led from youthful passion to elaborate murder across the span of 20 years. The technical sophistication of Blackwood's death, the preservation of Alice's final scream, the desperate attempt to destroy evidence, all pointed to someone with both the knowledge and the emotional investment to transform a tragic secret into an elaborate weapon of justice. So Dr. Pembroke was Alice's secret lover, Inspector Slack observed grimly, and she was threatening to expose their relationship. That provides clear motive for her death 20 years ago, but how does it connect to Blackwood's murder? The answer, Miss Marple suspected, lay in the complex web of guilt, protection, and delayed justice that had been woven around Alice Hartwell's death. Someone had preserved not only her final scream, but also the evidence of her affair, waiting for the perfect moment to use both as weapons against the man who had silenced her forever. As they prepared to leave her cottage, Timothy Fletcher appeared at the garden gate with a sort of determined urgency that suggested he had spent a sleepless night wrestling with difficult knowledge. His face bore the strain of someone who had discovered that his romantic devotion had placed him at the center of a murder investigation. "Miss Marple, Inspector," he began, his mechanic's hands twisting his cap nervously. "There's something more about that letter fragment I found. When I was clearing the grate, I discovered it wasn't the only thing that had been burned. There were other papers, older ones, tied with ribbon. Most were destroyed, but I managed to save this." He produced a small, partially charred photograph that showed 2 figures by the village pond, a young woman whose beauty was unmistakably that of Alice Hartwell, and a man whose face, though younger, was recognizably Dr. Geoffrey Pembroke. The intimacy of their pose left no doubt about the nature of their relationship, and the inscription on the back, in Alice's flowing handwriting, read, "My beloved Geoffrey, may our love survive all obstacles, A.H., September 1904. The photograph provided the final piece of documentary evidence linking Dr. Pembroke to Alice Hartwell's death, but Miss Marple found herself thinking beyond the immediate implications toward the larger questions of justice and retribution. Someone had carefully preserved these materials for 20 years, maintaining them as evidence against a crime that had never been officially recognized as such. "Inspector," she said thoughtfully, "I believe it would be wise to gather the principal parties this afternoon. Mrs. Bantry would be delighted to host a small gathering at Gossington Hall, ostensibly to discuss the proper disposition of the charity auction funds after such a tragedy. People will come for propriety's sake who might otherwise avoid a more official summons." As they made their preparations for what Miss Marple knew would be the final confrontation, she reflected on the elaborate nature of the justice that had finally been served. The gift that screamed at midnight had indeed been a voice from the grave, but it had also been the instrument of someone who had waited 2 decades for the perfect moment to let the dead speak their truth. The question was no longer merely who had killed Alistair Blackwood, but who had loved Alice Hartwell enough to preserve her voice as evidence, and what final revelation would emerge when all the participants in this 20-year tragedy were brought together for the last time. The drawing room at Gossington Hall had been transformed by Mrs. Bantry's enthusiastic preparations into something approaching a formal tribunal, though she would have been horrified at such a description. The afternoon light slanted through tall windows, casting long shadows across the assembled company, as they arranged themselves with the careful precision of people who sensed they were participating in something far more significant than a discussion of charity funds. Miss Marple settled herself in her accustomed corner chair, her knitting bag at her feet and her mild blue eyes taking in every detail of the gathering. Inspector Slack stood near the mantelpiece, his notebook ready and his expression suggesting a man who had finally begun to see the complete picture emerging from what had initially appeared impossible. The evidence they had collected over the past 2 days lay arranged on Mrs. Bantry's polished side table like pieces of an intricate puzzle, finally ready to be assembled. Dr. and Mrs. Pembroke occupied the settee with the rigid posture of people bracing themselves for an ordeal. Margaret's hands were clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles showed white through her gloves, while her husband maintained his professional composure with visible effort. Rosalind Hartwell sat near the window, her usual serenity marked by an underlying tension that spoke of secrets finally approaching the surface. Patricia Wynne remained close beside her, watchful and alert, her sharp intelligence evident in the careful way she observed each person in the room. Timothy Fletcher had positioned himself near the door, his mechanic's hands twisting his cap as his attention remained fixed on Rosalind with the sort of protective devotion that made young men do desperate things. Colonel and Mrs. Hartwell completed the assembly, their military bearing intact, despite the obvious strain of having their charity auction transformed into the scene of an elaborate murder. "It's remarkable," Miss Marple began gently, her knitting needles clicking with soft precision, "how the past refuses to remain buried, particularly when it involves matters of the heart. We've discovered so much about that terrible night 20 years ago when Alice Hartwell died, and how it connects to Mr. Blackwood's equally tragic end." She reached for Alice's journal, handling it with the reverence due to objects that carry the weight of human secrets. This belonged to Alice, and it documents in heartbreaking detail her secret engagement to a married man, someone whose medical practice and social standing would have been destroyed if their relationship became known. The journal's revelations about Alice's affair with Dr. Geoffrey Pembroke sent a visible shock through the assembled group. Margaret Pembroke's face went ashen, while her husband's carefully maintained professional demeanor showed the first hairline cracks. Most tellingly, Rosalind Hartwell's reaction was not surprise, but something approaching relief, as if a burden she'd carried for years was finally being acknowledged. Alice was threatening to expose their relationship, Miss Marple continued, producing the charred photograph Timothy had rescued. This image, found among recently burned correspondence, shows the intimate nature of their connection. On the night she died, Alice had given Dr. Pembroke an ultimatum. Either he would leave his wife, or she would reveal their affair herself. Inspector Slack stepped forward to display the technical evidence they had gathered. "The murder weapon itself was ingeniously constructed," he explained. "A hidden phonograph device that could be triggered by pulling the ribbon on the auction parcel, combined with a poison delivery system that required medical knowledge to create. Someone had preserved Alice Hartwell's final scream for 20 years, waiting for the perfect moment to use it as a weapon." The silence that followed was broken by Margaret Pembroke's sudden, choked whisper. "That voice. I knew that voice. It was exactly as I remembered from that terrible night." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her gentle tone encouraging confession. "You were there, weren't you, Margaret, when Alice came to your house that final evening, demanding that Geoffrey choose between you? You heard her desperation, her threats to destroy everything you had built together." "She was wild with passion," Margaret whispered, her composure finally cracking. "Screaming at Geoffrey, clawing at his face, threatening to ruin us both. I couldn't let her destroy our life, our marriage, his medical practice. When she turned on me, calling me names, saying I was standing in the way of true love, I pushed her. She fell down the stone steps, and that scream, that terrible, final scream." Dr. Pembroke's professional mask crumbled completely as his wife's confession hung in the air. "We carried her to the pond," he added, his voice hollow with 20 years of accumulated guilt. "Made it appear she had fallen in accidentally. Margaret was protecting our life together. I couldn't let her suffer for what was essentially self-defense." But Miss Marple's attention had shifted to Patricia Wynne, whose composed exterior was beginning to show signs of strain. "You were Alice's dearest friend, weren't you, Patricia? Close enough that she might have confided her plans for that final confrontation. Close enough, perhaps, that you followed her to the Pembroke house that night. Patricia's carefully maintained facade began to crumble. Alice asked me to wait outside, to be her support if things went badly. I heard everything. The argument, the struggle, that terrible scream when she fell. I saw them carry her body to the pond, watched them stage the scene to look like an accident. "And you made a recording," Miss Marple observed gently. "Using Dr. Pembroke's own medical equipment, you preserved Alice's final cry, thinking someday you would find the courage to seek justice for your friend's death." The confession came in a torrent of tears and 20 years of suppressed grief. I couldn't bear the thought that Alice would die unavenged, that her death would be dismissed as a simple accident when she had been murdered, even if it was in a moment of panic. I kept the evidence, waiting for the right moment, the right opportunity. And Alistair Blackwood provided that opportunity, Inspector Slack concluded grimly. His investigations into local history brought him dangerously close to the truth about Alice's death. When he began making threats, you realized you finally had the perfect cover for using your preserved evidence as a weapon. Patricia nodded through her tears. He was going to expose everything anyway, destroy the Pembroke's reputation for his own amusement. I thought if Alice's voice could finally speak the truth about that night, it would be a kind of justice. The charity auction provided the perfect stage, a public venue where the impossible could occur, where Alice could finally be heard. Miss Marple set down her knitting with gentle finality. The technical sophistication of the murder weapon, the phonograph device, the poison delivery system activated by the victim's shock, all required considerable planning and expertise. You spent months preparing, didn't you? Testing the mechanism, refining the poison dosage, ensuring that Blackwood would hear Alice's voice one final time before facing his own mortality. As Inspector Slack moved to make the necessary arrests, Miss Marple reflected sadly on the complex nature of the justice that had finally been served. The gift that screamed at midnight had indeed been a voice from the grave, but it had also been the instrument of a friendship so deep that it could wait 2 decades for the perfect moment to speak truth to power. In the quiet that followed the confessions, the assembled company sat in stunned silence, processing the revelation that their peaceful village had harbored such dark secrets for so long. Alice Hartwell had finally found her voice again, and through it, the justice that had been denied her for 20 years had been delivered, though at a price that would forever change the quiet community of St. Mary Mead. The church clock chimed 4 in the distance, marking the end of an afternoon that had begun with questions and ended with truth, terrible, devastating truth that had been preserved in the voice of the dead and delivered with the precision of the most carefully crafted murder weapon ever conceived in the annals of village crime. The silence that followed Patricia Wynn's confession settled over Gossington Hall's drawing room like a shroud, broken only by the soft tick of Mrs. Bantry's mantel clock and the distant sound of Inspector Slack's motor car carrying the guilty parties away from St. Mary Mead. The assembled company sat in stunned contemplation, each processing the revelation that their quiet village had harbored such dark secrets for 20 years, and that justice, when it finally came, had taken such an elaborate and deadly form. The legal proceedings that followed moved with the sort of merciful efficiency that the courts occasionally display when confronted with crimes that defy conventional categorization. Patricia Wynn's confession to the murder of Alistair Blackwood was accepted without contest, her evident remorse and the extraordinary circumstances of her 20-year vigil weighing heavily in the magistrate's considerations. The sentence, while necessarily severe, acknowledged that her crime had been born not of malice but of a friendship so deep that it could not bear to see injustice triumph over truth. Dr. Geoffrey Pembroke voluntarily surrendered his medical license before formal proceedings could begin, the weight of his long-concealed guilt finally proving unbearable when exposed to public scrutiny. His confession to the manslaughter of Alice Hartwell and the subsequent cover-up brought a measure of legal closure to a death that had haunted the village's collective memory for 2 decades. Margaret Pembroke, whose moment of panic had set the entire tragedy in motion, received the court's compassion for a woman whose protective instincts had led to consequences she could never have foreseen. Inspector Slack's final report detailed the ingenious nature of Patricia's murder weapon with the sort of grudging admiration that professionals reserve for exceptional craftsmanship, however misguided its purpose. The hidden phonograph mechanism, concealed behind the village hall stage, had been activated by a thread attached to the fatal parcel's ribbon. When Blackwood opened the box and pulled the ribbon free, Alice Hartwell's preserved scream had filled the hall with devastating effect. The poison delivery system had been equally sophisticated. A mother-of-pearl hat-pin whose point had been tipped with crystallized prussic acid and sealed beneath a tiny cap of wax. Patricia's movement forward to admire Blackwood's purchase had provided the perfect opportunity for a gentle brush against his collar, no more than a gesture of feminine balance in a crowded room. The victim's own body heat had dissolved the wax seal, allowing the concentrated poison to enter his system just as Alice's voice reached across 20 years to claim her final justice. The Pembrokes departed St. Mary Mead quietly, seeking refuge in a cottage in the Lake District where they might attempt to rebuild their marriage on the foundation of shared confession rather than mutual deception. The village watched their departure with the sort of respectful silence that communities reserve for neighbors who have paid a terrible price for human weakness. Rosalind Hartwell, freed at last from the shadow of unanswered questions about her sister's death, found in the truth a kind of peace that 20 years of speculation had never provided. Her engagement to Timothy Fletcher, announced quietly in the following month, was received with the gentle approval that villagers bestow upon matches that promise happiness after sorrow. Timothy's devotion had deepened rather than diminished through the crisis, his protective instincts proving themselves genuine rather than merely romantic. Mrs. Hartwell, with characteristic organizational efficiency, redirected the charity auction proceeds toward a memorial fund for those taken before their time, while Mrs. Bantry arranged a proper memorial service for both Alice Hartwell and, with typical Christian charity, Alistair Blackwood himself. Whatever his faults, she observed to Miss Marple over tea, the poor man didn't deserve such an elaborate death. Among Patricia Wynn's effects, discovered by the cottage's new tenants, was a collection of gramophone cylinders carefully stored in a cedar box. Most contained nothing more significant than voice exercises and practice recordings, but one bore Alice Hartwell's name and held not a scream of terror, but a song, a sweet, lilting melody that spoke of joy and hope rather than fear and death. This final recording, donated to the church archives, provided a gentle counterpoint to the voice that had delivered such devastating justice, reminding the village that Alice had been more than a victim. She had been a young woman full of life and dreams, whose memory deserved to be preserved in joy as well as sorrow. As the weeks passed and St. Mary Mead began the slow process of healing, Miss Marple made her customary rounds through the village, observing how communities possess a remarkable capacity for absorbing even the most shocking truths and finding ways to continue their essential rhythms of daily life. The gift that screamed at midnight had indeed been a voice from the grave, but it had also been something more, a testament to the enduring power of friendship, the patient nature of true justice, and the extraordinary lengths to which people would go to ensure that the dead were finally heard. Standing by the village pond, where a simple memorial bench now bore Alice Hartwell's name, Miss Marple reflected on the complex nature of human justice and the way the past refuses to remain buried when truth demands acknowledgement. Patricia Wynn's elaborate murder weapon had been more than a device for killing. It had been a memorial to friendship, a testament to loyalty, and ultimately a voice for those who could no longer speak for themselves. The church clock chimed 12 as Miss Marple reached her garden gate, marking another day's end in a village that had learned, once again, that beneath the surface of even the most tranquil communities flow the eternal currents of love, loss, and the relentless human demand for justice. In her sitting room, she settled into her favorite chair with her knitting, reflecting that while the mystery was solved and the guilty punished, the true resolution lay in the village's gradual return to the gentle rhythms of ordinary life. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall over St. Mary Mead, covering the village in pristine white that would, by morning, make everything appear fresh and new again. But Miss Marple knew that beneath the surface, the eternal human dramas would continue their timeless dance. And somewhere, perhaps, another voice from the past was waiting for its moment to speak truth to power, to ensure that justice, however delayed, would eventually find its way home. The gift that screamed at midnight had delivered far more than death. It had brought truth, closure, and ultimately a kind of peace to those who had waited 20 years to hear Alice Hartwell's voice speak one final time. And in the gentle silence that followed, St. Mary Mead settled into its healing sleep, knowing that some secrets, once spoken, could finally rest in peace.